Hello, and welcome to our special virtual presentation, a celebration of life and of lives, presented by the Hoover Presidential Foundation. I'm Jerry Flegel, President and CEO of the Foundation, and I'd like to start by thanking you for staying with us as we've rescheduled this program from a month ago. Originally planned to air on Herbert Hoover's birthday on August 10th, our area was hit by a horrific storm, which brought winds of up to 140 miles per hour, knocking down tens of thousands of trees and taking out the power at over 200,000 homes and businesses. Now, the cleanup still continues, but the power is back on, and we're happy to have Herbert Hoover's great-grandson, Alan Hoover III, present tonight's program. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to join us on September 17th at 6 p.m. for our next Third Thursday program, A Brief History of Women's Suffrage from 1840 through 1920. Now, advanced registration is also required for this program, and it's free as well. You can learn more about it and sign up at our website, hooverpresidentialfoundation.org, and just look under the News and Events tab. Now, as you view tonight's webinar, we invite you to enter questions through the Q&A feature you'll find along the edge of your screen. You also may vote for questions someone else has entered if you'd like to hear those answered, as we might not have enough time to answer all the questions. And all the questions, the top vote getters will be asked first. As I said, each year during Hoover's Hometown Days in August, we celebrate Herbert's birthday with a celebration of life. Tonight, Alan Hoover will share some Hoover history as we celebrate Herbert and the lives of those involved with his humanitarian efforts, including those that were saved by those efforts. This includes tens of thousands of Polish children members and leaders of the Commission for the Relief of Belgium, the American Relief Administration, as well as a story of a man saved by the ARA after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Alan Hoover III. Alan grew up in Sacramento, California, and received a BS in civil engineering from the University of California, Berkeley in 1993. He is married to Michelle and has 3 children, Mary, Andrew, and Thomas. They've lived in many locations, including Chicago, Little Rock, and Omaha, and they currently live in a suburb, a suburb of Denver, Colorado. Alan worked for Kuwait Infrastructure for 20 years until 2016 on projects all across the country. Alan also serves on boards related to the Herbert Hoover legacy and has managed independent residential real estate investments since 2009. Alan also enjoys golf, surfing, and traveling. However, of the 3 activities, Alan says he's only skilled at traveling. Alan, when you're back to West Branch next time, we're going to have to go to the golf course. Alan, thank you so much for being here tonight as our special guest.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. When I used to play golf quite a bit, but recently when people ask me, I just simply say, I own a set of golf clubs. So but I would love to play golf the next time in West Branch. That'd be a lot of fun. Well, thank you, Jerry, for that very kind introduction. And really, it's quite an honor to speak for our Zoom version of the celebration of life today, celebrating great-granddad's 146th birthday, plus the 30 days, as Jerry alluded to earlier, his birthday being on the 10th of August. Well, and by the way, our family expresses our sympathies and prayers to those that were affected by the strong windstorm that hit in early August. Well, normally when we do this celebration, we hold a ceremony in West Branch at the Hoover campus. And since we can't do that today, we thought, well, it would be a great idea to bring the campus to you. And so here is a picture of great-granddad on his 80th birthday. Now, this photo brings me to a point that this is an interactive presentation today. I'll be periodically asking questions, and those of you that are on this Zoom call can certainly click on the Q&A button that Jerry described earlier, and you can type in your answers, in the Q&A box. And so, Will, we might as well, let's try that out. Yeah, taking a look at this picture, I guess my question for the group today, as everybody opens up their question and answer box, would be, does anybody recognize where this picture was taken? Now, I kind of have given a hint already that it was in West Branch, but does anybody recognize perhaps even where in West Branch this might have been taken? Well, for those of you that guessed the pavilion on the National Park site, you are correct. That structure is still there today. In fact, for the Uncommon Student Award presentations, we hold our Sunday picnic orientation at that same pavilion. So it's kind of nice to know that there's a little bit of history associated with that pavilion when we get together there every June. So, well, I would like to use the time today to not necessarily talk about great-granddad, but share the stories of those that his humanitarian efforts had a tremendous impact, and in some cases, saving lives of families, other cases, creating a multiplier effect of saving many millions more. By celebrating the lives of people like Maurice Pate, Ignacy Paderewski, Yakov Zapasakny, Zenaida Tiablakova, and others, we're also celebrating great-granddad's life. And as many of you know, one of Herbert Hoover's greatest accomplishments was as a humanitarian, saving tens of millions of lives. Tens of millions of lives. It's a really large number. It's really hard to put into perspective. So I thought I could talk about maybe tens of millions of lives as being equivalent to the number of people that live in the Midwestern section of the United States. States such as Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, South Dakota, North Dakota, Ohio, Indiana. You know, maybe we can stretch it a bit. Well, let's include Colorado. Well, we're still not there yet, so let's add another 30 million people from Texas, and that'll get us in the ballpark of the tens of millions of lives. Well, that is quite a few people that live in those states. And when you put it in that regard, it really kind of helps understand the magnitude of that number. And also, this means tens of millions of stories of people who survived and went on to be productive in the world, who made it a better place. Also of people who had a significant impact and continued on to create an even bigger impact on Earth. Well, the first story I'd like to share begins with Maurice Pate. After graduating from Princeton, he immediately went to work for his uncle's bank in Hartley, Iowa, the First National Bank. Then he saw an advertisement to join the Belgian Relief Commission. He was intrigued by this, so much so that he immediately went to New York and applied. Well, actually, I understand he pleaded for a job to join this humanitarian organization, even though he was only 21 years old. The people in New York must have seen something special, as he was sent to Belgium right away and met Herbert Hoover soon after arriving in June of 1916. This was the beginning of an extremely impactful relationship. Well, remember Pate, as we'll get back to this story later on. Vernon Kellogg, pictured here, was the director of the CRB under Hoover, presumably when Pate arrived. Kellogg was a native of Emporia, Kansas, and a professor at Stanford at the same time Herbert Hoover was finishing his senior year at Stanford. After Kellogg was director of the CRB, he continued working with Hoover as the world saw the tremendous impact the CRB had, namely saving over 6 million Belgians from starvation. As the war came to a conclusion, he helped Great-Granddad with a much larger effort to get food to 400+ million Europeans at risk of starvation. Eventually, this became known as the American Relief Administration, also known as the ARA. As Kellogg began to survey Europe at the beginning of a developing human catastrophe after World War I, he provided the following account to Hoover, and I quote, "When Hoover came to Paris in 1918, at the request of the President of the United States to organize the relief of the newly liberated peoples of Eastern Europe, terrible tales were brought to him of the suffering and the wholesale deaths of the children of these ravaged lands. And when those of us who went to Poland for him in January of 1919 to find out the exact conditions of the actual food needs of the 25 million freed people there, we made our report to him. A single unpremeditated sentence in this report seemed most to catch Hoover's eyes and hold his attention. It did more. It whetted his eyes and led to a special concentration of his efforts on behalf of the suffering children. This sentence was, 'We see very few children playing in the streets of Warsaw.' Why were they not playing? The answer was simple and sufficient. The children of Warsaw were not strong enough to play in the streets. They could not run. Many could not walk. Some could not even stand. Their weak little bodies were bones, clothed with skin, but not muscles. They simply could not play." And so the American Relief Administration leapt into action and helped feed more than 2 million Polish children daily at its peak. The organization raised 95,000 tons of foodstuffs for Poland at an estimated cost of $130 million while operating at least 6,000 kitchens. During the period 4 years following World War I, this organization provided more than 500 million meals to the Polish people alone. Then, in August of 1919, merely 8 months after that original report that we just mentioned, Herbert Hoover toured Eastern European cities to see the results of the ARA and see its effectiveness firsthand, including Warsaw, Poland. The citizens of Warsaw and the government officials of Poland made preparations to honor their guest and show him their gratitude. The one thing they decided to do, which was the best thing for the happiness of their guests that they possibly could have done, was to show them that the children of Warsaw could now walk. So more than 30,000 boys and girls were summoned hastily from the schools. They came with the very tin cups and pannikins from which they had just had their special meal of the day, served at noon in all the schools and special children's canteens, thanks to the Charity of America, as organized and directed by Hoover. And they carried their little paper napkins stamped with the flag of the United States, as you can see in this photo, which they could wave over their heads. And on an old racetrack of Warsaw, these thousands of restored children marched for 2.5 hours, never-ending files past the grandstand where sat the man who had saved them, surrounded by the heads of government and the notables of Warsaw. They marched and cheered, and they waved their little hands in cups and napkins, and all went by as decorously and in as orderly a fashion as many thousands of happy children, cheering children could be expected to, until suddenly a rabbit, yes, a rabbit, maybe not this specific rabbit, but a rabbit leapt out and started down the track. Then a large group of these children broke from the ranks and dashed madly after the rabbit, shouting and laughing. And they caught the rabbit and brought him in triumph as a gift to their guest, Herberta Hoovera, as they would say in Warsaw. But they were astonished to see, as they gave him their gift, that this great, strong man did just what any other human being could not have helped doing under these circumstances. They saw him cry, and they would not have understood if he had tried to explain to them that he cried because they had proved to him that they could run and play. So he didn't try, but the children of Warsaw had no need to feel sorry for him, for he cried because he was glad. Now, I would like to end this story with this photo taken of Hoover and the Polish Prime Minister at the parade at the Warsaw racetrack. Now, we'll come back to this photo in a little bit. Let's rewind to February of 1896, when Hoover was a recent graduate of Stanford, and Lou Henry, Hoover's future wife, and a few others, organized a musical recital at Stanford University. The performer was the famous Polish pianist Ignacy Jan Paderewski, who was already in town to perform in nearby San Jose. As Hoover explained later in life, he and a couple of partners thought it would be a good idea to feature Mr. Paderewski at this Stanford recital. Well, after the event, things didn't go quite as planned, and Hoover and his two partners offered Paderewski $150 with a promise to pay the balance of his fee, which I would presume was much more than the $150. Well, according to Hoover, as quoted in Freedom Betrayed, he said, quote, Paderewski laughed and proposed that we suspend the engagement until some future occasion when he was in the West. One of our members suggested we might not be able to do that, as we might then have to be dissolved. And so again, we offered our $150. Paderewski laughed again and said, well, we would postpone that also. Hoover continues with the story, fast forwarding many years later, and he said, quote, I recalled this episode to him, Paderewski, when as prime minister, I met him at the Paris Peace Conference. He chuckled again. So now back to this photo. Do you remember this photo from the Polish parade? Take a harder look. Do you recognize anybody in this picture? Go ahead and enter into the question and answer box if you do. Well, that's right. That's Herbert Hoover. And next to him, yes, that's Prime Minister Ignacy Jan Paderewski, the same man who performed that recital at Stanford many decades earlier, is standing next to Herbert Hoover. Yakov Zapasakny was born in a small village called Zapasashai on March 15, 1907. At the time, it was part of the Russian Empire. Today, this city is in southern Belarus. Yakov was the fifth of 6 children of Joseph and Gittel. His father had been the last of his siblings to stay in Tsarist Russia. On October 1st, 1920, a 13-year-old Yakov's life would change forever as he saw his father shot and killed in front of him during a pogrom. Pogrom is an organized massacre, and in this case, a massacre of Jewish people in a small village who were specifically targeted by the new Bolshevik communist government. Yakov and his family fled with other survivors into the forest. They would not risk going back to the village for months after the executions. Well, by February of 1921, Yakov and his family settled in Kiev. This was the beginning of the Russian famine in 1921 to 1923, and was the beginning of his familiarization of Herbert Hoover. 5 million more would die in this famine, but millions more were saved because of the help of Herbert Hoover and the American Relief Administration, or the ARA. In fact, over 20 million were saved by Hoover and the ARA as this humanitarian relief organization raced to feed starving Russians before winter set in. Well, with the loss of his father, Yakov always credited the ARA as saving his family from starvation. He would later write a document about some of these experiences, which, by the way, you can find that at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum in West Branch. Well, it wasn't just that this saved his life. His experience with the ARA kept him very pro-American, despite the Soviet propaganda, and generally optimistic that things would improve despite the many hardships that would follow him. By 1936, Yakov had married and had a son. Unfortunately, on June 23rd of that year, he was arrested by the Soviet secret police in front of his wife and son in the middle of the night. He was dragged off and then charged, possibly as a Trotsky sympathizer. Like most arrested under Stalin's rule, there was never any evidence of wrongdoing, and it remains unclear why he was arrested, though many do assume that they were Trotsky sympathizers when they were hauled off in this manner. Yakov was sentenced to 5 years in the Gulag, a labor camp in Vorkuta, Siberia. Vorkuta is a coal mining town north of the Arctic Circle, which, by the way, is considered the coldest town in all of Europe. And it is probably the coldest town in all of Europe because its temperatures commonly reach negative 61 degrees Fahrenheit in the wintertime. Well, since many did not survive working in Vorkuta, Yakov's wife and son had assumed he died. In Vorkuta, Yakov witnessed death, including summary executions carried out by the guards seemingly at random to keep prisoners in line. Yakov was eventually released at the end of the war, which, by the way, was far longer than his original sentence. After his release, he started a new life, remarried, and had 2 children, and eventually was able to emigrate to Israel in 1978, while one of their sons was able to emigrate to the United States. His other son was not allowed to leave the Soviet Union until 1988, when he joined Yakov in Israel. And then Yakov passed away 4 years later in 1992. Now, this is a photo of a more senior Yakov Zapasakny, but I wanted to add his grandson, Robert Zapasakny, said this of his grandfather, and I quote, "He was a remarkable optimist when he had good reasons to be bitter. In a country where some people had to constantly worry about someone betraying them, it was remarkable to watch people cross a great ocean and help other people. The fact that this happened so shortly after his father was killed, he came to see that good things could happen even after every terrible thing that happened to him. It became the core of his personality. While most Russians slowly became disillusioned with communism, my grandfather made the transition to anti-communist more quickly than others for 2 reasons. First, his experiences in the Gulag and the Soviet system, and second, the profound decency of the American people just shortly after his father died." The next story is about Zenaida Tyablakova, as told by her granddaughter, Natalia Sidorova. Now, I hope you'll agree, Natalia created such an amazing description of her grandmother in the ARA that I will simply provide her account. And she says, "About 97 years ago, my grandmother, Zenaida Tyablakova, moved to Moscow from her small town, Klin, 50 miles to the north. She lived alone while she studied chemistry at Moscow University. At that time, there was a terrible food shortage throughout all of Russia as a result of the chaos following the Bolshevik Revolution and the civil war between white and red Russians. Many poor Russians from the Volga region came to Moscow in desperate hope of finding food in the city. In 1920, a friend of my grandmother told her that the American Food Administration provided warm meals once a day for needy people, primarily children. Although most of the food centers were in the Volga region, where starvation was an enormous problem, there also were a few food centers in Moscow. My grandmother Zenaida went to one of those food centers on Myasnitskaya Street in Moscow. Throughout most of 1920, she and many other persons received a delicious hot meal once a day. She remembered on occasion receiving condensed milk and hot chocolate. For the many poor Russians, these were special treats because they had never had condensed milk or chocolate before. Certainly, these nutritious meals protected her and many other persons from death by starvation or other diseases caused by a lack of food. She told me that there was a photo of Herbert Hoover on display at the food center even though Mr. Hoover himself did not want such public recognition. The people of the community chose to display his photo as their own spontaneous expression of their gratitude to Mr. Hoover and to the American people. I now have a daughter named Galina who goes to college here in America. I have told her this story of my grandmother. This story demonstrates to my daughter that the American and Russian people can be great friends to one another in times of need. I doubt that Mr. Hoover himself then was supportive to the Bolshevik ideology, which in recent years has fallen into disrepute even among conservative Russians. However, Mr. Hoover put aside his own personal beliefs about politics and economics so he could help other persons. My grandmother always spoke with great appreciation of the generosity of the American people as expressed through the person of Herbert Hoover. She was always amazed that Mr. Hoover possessed special administrative skills so that he could distribute food to remote regions where the food was in greatest demand. She was delighted for the American people when she learned years later that Mr. Hoover was elected president. She cherished the memory of his photo in the food center, and she prayed for him throughout her life. My grandmother is not with us anymore to express her own gratitude to Mr. Hoover. As her granddaughter, I accept that task with full enthusiasm. As an American citizen who was born in Moscow, I thank Mr. Hoover, and I thank all of the people of America for their generosity and compassion to millions of poor Russians in one of the darkest hours of our history. The legacy of Mr. Hoover's goodness and the goodness of the American people is inscribed in the hearts of millions of Russian people. Mr. Hoover's legacy is also a beacon of hope for future generations. In a world that continues to be torn apart by conflict of all types, Mr. Hoover's example reminds us that the best response to a crisis is compassion. Well, do you remember the story of Maurice Pate earlier? Feel free to chat if you do. Well, to continue that story, Maurice Pate and Herbert Hoover would be the definition of the phrase, birds of a feather flock together. Maurice Pate was born in small town Penner, Nebraska on October 14, 1894. His family then moved to Denver when he was 3. He graduated from East Denver High School and then from Princeton in 1915 with honors. As mentioned earlier, Pate went to work with Herbert Hoover as part of the Belgian Relief Commission. Pate worked with Hoover throughout other European relief and Polish efforts after World War I, namely the American Relief Administration, or the ARA, as we discussed earlier. As another humanitarian crisis developed during and after World War II, Pate left working for the American Red Cross and joined Hoover again, this time for the Commission for Polish Relief, starting in the fall of 1941. Here's a picture of great-granddad with children in Poland after this effort, signed and provided to Maurice Pate, which I think is a kind of a nice symbolic meaning of their friendship that those two had throughout their lives. Pate performed food surveys with Hoover between 1946 and 1947, and this is amazing. They traveled through 38 countries in 76 days. At one point in this effort, a woman in Warsaw came up to Hoover in Pate's presence and said, "Mr. Hoover, you saved my life in Warsaw after the First World War, and now you are saving the lives of my children." After Warsaw, Hoover then went to South America to organize further food relief efforts, and then met with Canadian officials about the seemingly constant problem of children around the world being undernourished as a result of, this time, World War II. Great-granddad remembered the effectiveness of the ARA after World War I and thought a similar organization was required. Hoover believed the United Nations was uniquely suited to solve this problem. The ARA was created as an emergency organization in World War I, so Hoover thought that World War II required a similar solution, but this time with the United Nations taking the lead. So Hoover went to work to make this a reality, and the United Nations passed a resolution creating this organization. Can anybody think of what the name of this organization is? Well, this organization was named the United Nations International Emergency Fund, also more commonly known as UNICEF. Well, now that UNICEF was an organization, they needed a leader. And who else but Maurice Pate, the same man who earlier in life desperately wanted to work with the CRB and save lives in Belgium. He served as director of UNICEF from its inception in 1947 until his death in January of 1965, mere months after his partner Herbert Hoover passed. Pate declined a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1960 because he felt the contributions of the entire UNICEF organization should be recognized instead of one individual's contribution. When he died, UNICEF had more than 550 long-term programs and had helped over 55 million children in 116 countries. 9 months after Pate died, and a little over a year after his mentor, Herbert Hoover, passed, UNICEF was awarded the 1965 Nobel Peace Prize. Well, these are just a few stories of great-granddad's amazing legacy. So why is it important that we share stories like this? Well, I believe that great-granddad left a legacy of accomplishment and service to mankind for all of us to aspire to. This is derived from the horrible human suffering that he witnessed firsthand during World War I and World War II. In fact, he saw with his own eyes the tragic results of totalitarian regimes that impoverished their own people and drove them to war, to human suffering, and to starvation. Great-granddad wanted these stories and these lessons told for future generations so that they would be shielded from oppressive governments like those that were the background of today's stories. Well, fortunately, the Hoover Presidential Foundation supports the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum and the Herbert Hoover National Historic Site, and it supports them to keep these stories and these lessons alive. Now, I also believe that it is our privilege to be associated with this great American legacy. And I urge you to constantly nourish this legacy with your generous support, with your means, and your time. And with that, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to share these wonderful stories with you. And before we take some questions, I would just like to acknowledge and thank a number of people who helped contribute to these stories and did a lot of research to put these together. And I would like to thank Tom Schwartz, the director of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum, Robert Pasachny, whose grandfather's record of events is at the Library Museum in West Branch. Also, Nicholas Sikierski, a researcher who worked at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives for 13 years and currently hosts a website titled Research Teacher, History, Culture, Politics. And also Alexander Leach, a biographer of Maurice Pate. And lastly, I'd also like to thank George Nash, who is Herbert Hoover's biographer and has done considerable research, probably spent more time than any other human being in the research room in West Branch. We'd like to thank them all for their tremendous research in assembling these stories so that we can talk about them today. So now, Jerry, I guess that concludes the formal part of this, and we'd like to pass it to you for some questions.
Well, Alan, great presentation on there, and I know how hard you've worked on this and really put a lot of effort, and obviously you had a lot of help. So, thank you so much. I've got a few questions. Actually, I had a couple that were texted in, not on the Q&A, and one pertained to children. Obviously, Herbert Hoover had a great fondness for children. on there, and especially worldwide. How about in his own family with his sons and grandsons and great grandsons, so forth like that? Do you have any story, maybe stories that you could share with the audience this evening?
Well, I think, there's one that kind of stands out to me. And when we were preparing for the charrette meetings with VRC Imagination Arts a number of weeks ago, in some discussions about what we wanted the future of the library and museum to look like, a comment came up about Hoover and his family. And there wasn't a whole lot that was talked about. It made me think that, gosh, I think there has to be something. It's almost like everything in his life. There has to be something. And so I went through my dad's records of the letters that he had, and he had a lot of them, and between him and his grandfather. And it's funny because it starts with his birthday, a short telegram from Herbert Hoover to my dad saying, "Dear Alan Jr., congratulations on your birth. Hope there's many more to come. Love, Granddad." And then there was probably, of course, there was a number of them, but then just as an example, another one was his first birthday. "Dear Alan Jr., congratulations on your first birthday. I think of you often. Lots of love, Granddad." And then there was some that I read a little bit later when he was 10 years old that I found really interesting. And it started off with my dad writing a letter to his grandfather, thanking him for, it was either a Christmas present or a birthday present based on the time of year. But he wrote the note to Granddad and said, "Thank you for the typewriter. I will use it often. We are proud of what you are doing in Germany. We're proud of your work. We love you very much, your grandson, Alan Jr." And so Herbert Hoover responded back, and now's where the backstory kind of comes in. My father was born legally blind. Whenever I saw him reading the newspaper, he could only read the headlines of the Wall Street Journal, as an example. So he would have his magnifying glass and he'd be reading the headlines, and that's all he could read. He could never read the fine print. Well, now going back, Herbert Hoover recognized this. He knew this. And so, and in fact, the typewriter that my dad had large type. It was especially made, had to have been a specially made typewriter for him so that he could type in large letters and read his letters. Well, Granddad didn't have that typewriter. So what he did was he wrote in large block pencil letters, and he responded back saying, "Dear Alan, thank you for the note. I am pleased you are happy with your new typewriter. It is a much better machine than this pencil." Then he goes on to say, "I think of you and Andy and Lou often. How is the dog? Love, Granddad." And then Dad responded back with a letter to kind of close the story and said, "Dear Granddad, thank you for the note. Chiefy is a good dog. Chiefy used to chase motorcycles, but he learned his lesson. He doesn't chase motorcycles anymore. Lots of love, your grandson, Alan." So, I think he was very aware of his grandchildren for sure, as I can attest to. But I think he also ran some mines with his sons, Alan Sr., my grandfather, and his brother Herb Jr. So I think there was a lot of connection, maybe behind the scenes, that maybe the media and the press may not have known about.
Okay, well, great. And I invite the audience to, if you got any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A, and we'll have Alan take a shot at answering them. One other question I guess I'd like you to touch upon, or maybe it's not a question so much, is I've heard you tell the story about the boy that came from Michigan all the way to the White House. Could you maybe share that with the audience, Alan?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So sometimes, again, there's a number of things that you hear about Herbert Hoover and you think, God, that's just not right. And so one of the things that people tend to say is Herbert Hoover was not compassionate. And I say that is really the furthest from the truth. And here is an example of that. So the boy that you mentioned from Michigan. So great granddad was president. It was the depths of the Depression, I believe, in the banking crisis when things were really bad. And a boy had made his way from Detroit all the way to Washington, D.C., somehow on his own. And he gets to the White House and he asks the secretary, I would like to meet with the president. I need to talk to him. Well, the secretary comes to Hoover and says, hey, there's a young boy out there. He came here from Michigan on his own. You know, I can just shoo him away if you like. And great granddad said, no, by God, if that kid got here on his own, all the way from Detroit, he can certainly see me. And so the boy came in and Hoover spoke with him and asked him, well, what can I do for you? And the boy said, well, my dad lost his job and some petty crime, I don't recall what, but there was a petty crime involved and my father is in jail. Can you help me? And so Hoover responded saying, son, just head on back home. Everything will be taken care of. And so the boy left. Hoover called in another secretary or another aide and said, get that boy's man out of jail and see what you can do about getting him a job. So, and that's what happened. Well, the press secretary got wind of this, and the press secretary said, Mr. President Hoover, we have got to let the world know about this story to show the compassionate side of you. And great granddad said, no, we will not publish this story. We are not going to politicize this for the sake of this boy. That's the end of it. And so that kind of illustrates, I think, a good example of Hoover's compassion where it happened behind the scenes. But again, and he wasn't really big on getting things into the press like that. He just wanted to get the job done.
Well, and along those lines, your great grandmother was also, after she passed, the story where all the people that she had helped out and they had repaid her. And you want to just tell the story about the checks?
Yeah. So unfortunately, great grandmom, she died a young lady in 1945, I believe. Great granddad survived for almost another 20 years. And so when she passed, the family was going through her things. And as they did so, they found a number of uncashed checks. Well, what the story was that she would get letters from people all over the country asking for help. And sometimes she would write back and say, hey, contact this agency or contact this. And she would do it anonymously so that it wouldn't draw too much attention to her or to the family or to Herbert Hoover. And so she did this anonymously. And sometimes she would help people. And if there wasn't a local agency, she would just write a check to these people. Well, sometimes, people would figure out that, okay, Lou Henry Hoover was the one that wrote this check, so they'd pay her back. They'd send a check back to her. Well, she never cashed those checks. So they would open books and open up her bureau, and they found all of these uncashed checks that she never did, just because she just felt she was just being generous. And I think since we bring up Lou Henry Hoover, I think a few other things. She was a remarkable woman in her own right. She helped translate the Agricola de Metallica with great granddad, and because she was the linguist. She knew 7 languages. And so she was a critical element of translating that mining text. And that mining text was important because it unlocked a lot of technologies from centuries before, of mining technologies that had been lost and were in this book. And so Herbert Hoover and Lou Henry together unlocked all of these secrets. And really, it was a huge contribution to the mining industry, so much so that they won a number of awards for within the industry. So, and of course, she was also, many people I think know her for her time as president of the Girl Scouts. And her big, she had many contributions, but the one that she's most well known for is the creation of the fundraiser of Girl Scout cookies. So if you see Girl Scout cookies being sold outside the grocery store, that's where the idea started, was with Lou Henry Hoover.
And every year on Lou's birthday, on March 29th, we give away free Girl Scout cookies at the library in honor of her service.
All right.
So, well, Maria and Kevin have a question, and their question is, do you have a favorite artifact or memento in the Presidential Museum?
Oh gosh, that's really tough. You know, there's so many things. There's the flour sacks that represent all the humanitarian efforts from Belgium. So when they would, the flour sacks would be full of flour or sugar or different food commodities that they would send over to Belgium to help feed the country. And of course, the country had these empty flour sacks, and they were getting recycled and reused. You know, Hoover's efficiency. He was really efficient with a lot of things. He don't let anything go to waste. Well, the Belgians saw these flour sacks going back, and they thought, well, let's thank the BRC and Herbert Hoover by embroidering all these beautiful embroideries and stitchings that they did on these flour sacks, and sent them back as a thank you to the BRC for providing all this food. But, you know, also I think the thing that's also a lot of fun, and it's often overlooked, the next time you're in the library, in the Oval Office area, if you're facing the Oval Office room and you turn to the right, there are a number of letters from children that Herbert Hoover wrote, that the children wrote to Herbert Hoover, and then he responded, and it's all right there. And it's some of the greatest entertainment that you'll have, and it's easy to miss. But the next time you're in the museum, definitely look for that, and it'll give you a good laugh. I always love to read those when I come back in West Branch.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I call it kind of the foyer into the Waldorf room.
Yes.
You look
yes.
just to the right. You look to the right, and they're along the wall. And if you're having a bad day, that's a great place to go. You'll have a smile on your face when you're done.
That's right.
So, well, one of the things that I would want to ask Alan is of course, you know, we're coming up on a presidential election, which is going to be hotly contested. And anyway, it always draws parallels, especially when they start talking about the economy. They'll go back to the Great Depression. Well, this hasn't happened since the Great Depression. And I see Google alerts myself every day on there with, I call it pretty erroneous information, I think, on there. Herbert Hoover caused the Great Depression. He did this, he did that. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, you know, there it is again. There's that thing where you see that and you think, this can't be right. You know, how could one man cause so much economic destruction? And so, you know, it's one of those things that's growing up that I remember I had 3 history teachers. The first one was completely off the mark about Hoover and the Depression, exactly what you're referring to with the Yahoo alerts that drive you crazy. And then the second teacher, he was almost, well, you're the great grandson of Herbert Hoover, you must know all about this, right? And so he kind of backed off. And then the third teacher, I think he knew I was coming, and so he got ready, and so that one worked out pretty good. But you know, since then, just being a member or being a descendant of Herbert Hoover, you know, you almost feel an obligation to study the Depression. I'm not an economist. I'm not a political scientist, but I do like to read and to study to be able to answer that question. And there was a book that was recommended to me, and it's called The Lords of Finance by Liaquat Ahmed. And the book talks about the 4 central bankers in the period before World War I. The German central banker, the British central banker, the French, and the US. And so he goes through, it's about a 700-page book, and it's all about what caused the Great Depression. And his answer, his summary at the end was that there were two primary reasons that caused the Great Depression. The first was the Treaty of Versailles, which, by the way, great-granddad was at the Treaty of Versailles, and he saw what was happening, and he saw how punitive all the countries were towards Germany. And he knew that this would not end well. And the interesting thing was the night before the signing of the treaty, he went for a walk, according to his book, The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson. He went for a walk, and at about 3 a.m., and he came across John Maynard Keynes, the famed British economist. Well, who would have thought that? So the two of them thought that, we can't let this treaty go through like it is. This will be too punitive for Germany, and this is going to come back and haunt the world, and we're going to be right back where we were with another world war sometime in the future. So they agreed to talk to their principals. Hoover talked to Woodrow Wilson, and Keynes talked to the British Prime Minister. Well, they were both unsuccessful. And sure enough, the debt burden on Germany was way too great that England and France were unable to pay, and therefore England and France were unable to pay their debts to the United States. And so the next reason that this dives into was failed monetary policy, the second reason. And this reason is probably the largest reason and the biggest inhibitor to any success that happened during the Hoover presidency. George Nash, he likens this to Hoover was doing all of these policies, but in the background, the monetary policy was completely undermining everything that was going on. The Fed kept interest rates too low for too long during the 1920s, and it caused a big speculative bubble in the stock market, which spectacularly popped. And then, of course, that was the beginning of the Great Depression. They thought they were through the worst of it about a year or so later, and then the banking crisis hit, and then again, the monetary policy underneath was causing so many problems. Now, don't take my word for that. Ben Bernanke, in 2002, the former chair of the Federal Reserve, in 2002, he was a speaker at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday. And at the end of his speech, he looked at Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, the two who wrote The Monetary History of the United States, one of the great economic works. And he looked at them and said, Anna and Milton, about the Great Depression, you were right. We blew it, and we're very sorry for it. So I think what would be great, Jerry, on one of our upcoming programs, if we can get Ben Bernanke to repeat that speech to all of us Hoover fans and Hoover family members, that would be terrific. So
we'll go to work on that one. That sounds like an assignment for me there. So, well, we're winding up the evening, and we really appreciate your time. I guess the one last question I would like to ask Alan is, if your great granddad was alive today, and you had a chance to ask him any question, what would that question be in person?
Oh gosh. I guess I would like to ask him, he was so prescient. He was so able to foresee what was going to happen in the future. You can read his books, Freedom Betrayed by George Nash, The Last Crusade, both those books. I mean, he really predicted down to the detail what was going to happen after his life ended. I mean, he knew the Soviet Union would collapse. He knew that socialism was not a long-term answer for anybody. And, a lot of those things have come to pass. And it'd be interesting to say, well, what about the next 20 years? What do you see happening in the next couple decades?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know in the Waldorf room, they have an old TV that shows clips of interviews with Herbert Hoover. I think it was probably circa 1959, 1960, so forth like that. And it is so amazing what he said to then has come true today on there. So,
yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you again, Alan, for a great program and sharing some wonderful Hoover history that we just don't get to hear much about these days. Your great-grandfather truly was a remarkable man. Now, before we leave tonight, I'd like to remind everyone here that tonight's program was recorded and may be found on Facebook, page and the YouTube channel tomorrow after it's been processed. Just search for Hoover Presidential Foundation on either site and we're easy to find. And I would like to invite you all to visit and explore our website at hooverpresidentialfoundation.org under the Events tab, where you'll find other great programs like this one, including details on upcoming Third Thursday virtual programs and other information, like how to become a member of the foundation or how to make a financial gift in support of our efforts, just like this evening. Again, thank you, Alan, for a great presentation, and thank all of you for your participation tonight in the program and watching. Good night, and have a great weekend.